And this is Elena from the Department of Geography at Florida State University.
Great. Thank you for that introduction and thanks for having me today. I'll be talking about a project that I've just started using NASA's Black Marble to map power outages and link these to disasters and health outcomes. So the next slide. So there's a growing body of evidence that's linking disasters to adverse mental health outcomes. Extreme events cause stress both in the immediate through things like fear and injury, and also in their aftermath. Through these events, we see prolonged stress due to disruption in the community and infrastructure, loss of property, as well as displacement and a lack of access to resources. And chronic stress actually impacts the regulatory function in the brain, and a prolonged stress response is associated with conditions that are commonly diagnosed after disasters. So we're looking at things like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, depression, as well as substance abuse and suicides. And disasters are also responsible for the majority of major power outages in the US. So we're looking at large outages here affecting over 50,000. And you can see from 2000 to 2016, severe weather was responsible for most of the large outages in the US. So not only are people coping with disasters, but they're coping with power outages, which can increase psychological stress, both by interrupting everyday life. And for those that are medically vulnerable, it can impact their ability to seek treatment if clinics are closed, or to maintain their conditions if they need to keep medications cool or rely on electricity to do at-home treatments. So for this project, I really wanted to look at how power outages might increase mental health disorders after disasters. So the next slide. Thank you. So I propose to map power outages in the US using NASA's Black Marble product, which is already corrected. And with this, we want to look at both the distribution and duration of power outages to get at really the severity of both the disaster and the outage and how these are working together to impact people's health. And so we want to validate and train the model through a series of steps and create something accurate as a sort of database so we can monitor power outages over time. Next slide. And so using power outages as an exposure, we can look at social vulnerability indices and environmental justice indices and see if these areas are overlapping. So are areas that are more vulnerable also experiencing more in distribution frequency or duration power outages? And as these areas are mostly more likely to experience adverse health outcomes as well. And then lastly, we want to funnel this down and look at disparities in power outages and see if these areas are also where we're seeing people diagnosed with more mental health conditions. So again, things like PTSD and depression and anxiety. And there are interventions that exist for people after disasters to help them cope with mental health. And so it's really important that we get these to the people that are most affected in the recovery period, especially when you're dealing with a large-scale disaster. And so I will end there and take questions and feedback. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you, Elena. We've got about 1 minute for questions. If there's any questions in the audience, and if the audience just wants to state the question, I'll restate it.
I have a question.
Tracy has a question. Go ahead.
This is really interesting, and I guess I'm curious about the. Hello, thanks for the talk. I was wondering about the value added of the satellite blue marble analysis versus kind of these online, is your power out kind of customer driven reporting, kind of the bottom up surveys of power outages and sort of versus the satellite data and what the satellite can provide.
So I think I caught that, so no need to restate it. So the satellite, I think, will cover the entire US and a more consistent time period. Whereas with the surveys, not all of them, I think, are public. And it can be hard to collect all that. So there's not like an existing database of power outages in the US. So the satellite could really fill this need and create like a database for the entire country to monitor both the distribution and duration, whereas it's a lot harder to collect from different utilities and surveys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to our next talk. And the next talk is by Abram, and he's going to talk about satellite technology tracker for monitoring gas flare CO2 emissions from oil and gas production in Nigeria. So go ahead.
Okay, good evening, and thanks for giving me this opportunity. My name is Mahmoud, and I'll just be talking about the prospect of the gas flare tracker for imaging the obscured from afar and in the upstream petroleum sector. Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't see the PDF, so.
So will you allow me
I'll
to
advance
share
the slide just a moment. Okay, great. So I'll have to look here to find it. I am still at a loss. Where do I? Got it. Okay, sorry about that. There you go. Next slide.
So in my next slide, okay, well, I can just continue with this. So the whole idea about the gas flare tracker or the Nigerian gas flare tracker is to, because of the obscurity around gas flare, access to gas flare sites and the data in itself, it was very important to look at what are the modern digital approach, and satellites happen to be one of the very good approach that is good for oil field data collection. So the gas flare tracker is a satellite-based approach to oil field monitoring. So in this slide, I will just talk about what the data speaks to. So we are able to use the gas flare tracker to collect or know the volume of gas that has been flared, and we can actually filter it on the basis of date, and we can compute CO2 emission, and we can also look at the value of the gas in terms of its monetary value, and then the penalties, because since 2018, before 2018, gas, it was illegal, it was not allowed to flare gas. But in 2018, the law was more stifled to look at penalties in a more serious way. And we're also able to compute the power generation potential of how much gas is being flared. And as you can see, we have data all the way from 2014 to date. But I just gave a bit of an instance from 2014 to date. So in my next slide, I'll just be talking about the volumes. The flare volumes at oil block. So you can see highlighted oil block, OML 60. And then you can see for various years from 2020, 2021, and we can see the different variety of information that can actually be computed from this. And this applies to all the oil blocks.
2 minutes.
So my next slide, I'll just talk about the opportunities to reduce gas flare. This is from a study that was conducted by OPM, Oxford Policy Management, and it was clear that we can see that there is a need to improve energy production, and a couple of wastages that is going on can actually be improved. However, clearly the study shows that there is an observed synchronicity and seasonal patterns from the flare performance trend. So in my next slide, I'll just talk a little about the flare performance trend. And clearly you can see that in the average on the graph to the left, you see that in the average for all the fields that were looked at, we have about 12 million cubic feet of gas, flare that's being done per month. And we can see some seasonal variability of the flaring performance. So some of the questions now is why routine flaring in these OMLs when you have gas infrastructure? So it's a bit puzzling when there are options to do reinjection. There are options to use the gas that is being flared at the power plant in the study area, or to even go for export. So these are some puzzling questions that I'm very interested in looking at, and overall why gas is being flared in Nigeria when the country is in dire need of the gas, either for utilization for various sectors of the economy. So I'll end my presentation here. In case I have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Go
you.
right ahead, Evan.
So yeah, I'm Evan Sherman. I'm a postdoc at Stanford, and I'm presenting on some tests I led last year. I'm actually literally in the outskirts of Phoenix right now, helping set up the next round of satellite testing. So next slide, please. So the big question we were asking is, how well do methane sensing satellites work, particularly point source sensors, looking at the specific sources? We set up for 19 days in Arizona on the California border. And advance, please. This is a cartoon I drew of me turning the methane knob up to 11. Advance, please. And this is pre-printed work that's up on Earth Archive, so please feel free to check it out for more detail. Next slide, please. So yeah, how did we release enough methane for satellites to be able to see it? We set up liquefied natural gas trailer, one trailer in the desert. We had a big heater to heat it back up because it's like minus 160 Celsius in the trailer. We had a big metering release apparatus. You can see that up in the middle. We were measuring wind speed from a 10-meter ultrasonic anemometer. Next slide, please. And we were releasing methane, and the satellite didn't know how much we were releasing. They sent their estimates. So here we have on the x-axis the different satellites that we tested, the release volumes that we actually released. That's in black underneath the satellite names. So Sentinel-2, Landsat 8, Prisma, Worldview 3, and GHG inset on the bottom right. And then for many of these satellites, multiple teams analyze the data. And you can see, so on the rows, that's all the same exact raw spectral data, just processed by different teams. And you can see that there's some similarities, but also there's a substantial variation in what's identified as a methane emission and the quantification that comes from that, even with exactly the same input data. And although there's variation in the wind reanalysis products used, so I guess I should say the same spectral data. We also see that some of the plumes look short, some look long. These are all about 4 tons per hour. So, and the wind speeds are pretty consistent.
If you're not speaking, so please mute. Sorry, go ahead.
And you can mute directly as well as an admin. Thank you. So a lot more that could be said about on here. Next slide, please. Big question, how well does the quantification work? Oh, here's the detection. Basically, most teams saw most of the outcomes. No false positives. Next slide, please. And here we have what we call a parity chart. So on the x-axis, that's what we were releasing. On the y-axis is what each team estimated for each satellite. The colors are the satellites, the shapes are the teams. And we see that there's a fair amount of scatter, but this is pretty much unbiased if we fit a line through everything. It's a rough statistical approximation, given that they're different satellites and teams, but the parity slope, ideally, that y, it would be equal to 1 times x, and it's 0.85, which is pretty good. So, and then GHG-SAT saw down to 200 kilograms per hour. Sentinel-2, 3 teams saw down to about 1.5 tons per hour of methane. There's a lot more again that in the preprint. Feel free to please check it out. Feel free to contact me. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll take questions. There should be my email up on the next slide, and I'll acknowledge my funders. And I'll put my email in the chat. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? If not, I have a question. Okay. Could you say any comment about the dependency on spatial resolution to their detection and whether how much that spatial resolution introduces bias? It looked like the Sentinel-2, which as I understand is one of the coarser ones, really had a pretty flat curve as opposed to capturing some of the variance.
Yeah. So spatial resolution certainly has a huge relationship to detection limit. I don't think we have the data yet to say. I certainly looking at the data that we have, I wouldn't say there's evidence of bias. I think there's a fair amount of scatter, but even there, even with airplane-based remote sensing, there's a fair amount of scatter. The bias tends to be, it's hard to establish essentially because it's a highly heteroscedastic function, and if you fit a line to something, even if it's anyway. More we could go on to there. I don't think that the Sentinel-2 is likely biased. My guess is it just has a higher detection limit.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
So hi everyone, I'm Akanksha. I'm a postdoc at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Atmosphere, CIRA CSU, and the NSF AI2S Institute, where I work on developing AI models to leverage the spatiotemporal information from the satellite data. The work that I'm presenting today is part of my doctoral thesis done at UMass Amherst. So breaking down the title of my talk, solar nowcasting means predicting solar at short time scales, like in the range of 0 to 60 minutes. And we use self-supervised model, which means that our work leverages information from unlabeled satellite data, and we then apply the extracted features on the site-specific solar data. Advance the slide, please. So solar is intermittent, thus making it challenging for it to use in conventional electric grid. The strong fluctuation in the solar power generation is mainly attributed to the sky's short-term cloud movements, as shown as in the graph here. On a partially cloudy day, abrupt cloud movements can cause almost 70 to 80% power loss within just a few minutes. Under large solar penetration, utilities keep many conventional generators active as spinning reserve to offset for the dips in solar power, which is both expensive and highly energy inefficient, or they install batteries. Both of these options are inefficient and stresses both the challenge and the need for accurate and reliable short-term solar forecast. Next slide, please. The main source of error while predicting solar is how we map the irradiance to the solar generation. Traditionally, this is done using the ground level sensors from weather stations, but it is actually the first 3 channels of the visible bands that are used by the solar panels to convert sunlight into solar power, which is available every 5 minutes from the geostationary satellites. The same is reflected in the graph on the right-hand side, where we see a normalized solar output strongly correlating with the first 3 channels from the satellite. We developed a solar modeling and a solar nowcasting framework using these first 3 channels. Next slide, please. Our solar nowcasting is composed of 2 blocks, a self-supervised model based on satellite data, followed by a solar modeling framework. Here is a breakdown of our self-supervised model. Given a set of solar sites of interest from the whole CONUS domain, we extract an area tile of around each site from a time series value of 3 visible channels from the GOES-16 satellite. We repeat this step for over 25 solar sites and 1 year to come up with one single global model. This enables the modeling of shared statistical properties across the different sites rather than overfitting to the peculiar characteristics of one single isolated site. The satellite data forms a 3D image that we first process using a CNN to extract the spatial features from the image. We then extract a temporal sequence of these images over time from the satellite and pass it through the LSTM network. Given such a trained CNN LSTM model that generates the future satellite observations at a given site, we further pass them through a solar modeling framework that maps the satellite observations to the actual solar generation. Next slide, please. Here I present one of our results from the end-to-end nowcasting results for predicting solar 15 minutes into the future. The performance of our proposed CNN LSTM is close to the actual future channel values in the model, showing that our approach is useful and accurate for solar nowcasting. Further, we also showed the approach using satellite data performs similar to the work done using sky cameras, which requires additional infrastructure and are also very cost inefficient. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions or also talk offline more.
Any questions? Tracy?
Thank you for the presentation. And thank you for the presentation. And have your nowcasting results, are you working with any electricity providers or users? Like
Oh, it is
who,
here.
who might use your nowcasting results?
I'm sorry.
And
Why is it?
is that, or is that too far in the future?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tracy. So right now we are not working with any of our solar providers or any of the utility companies to identify how this can be further used. So we are not doing any of that.
We're done.
Thank you.
So I have a short follow-up question. A lot of, for these for these short-term forecasts, uncertainty is another big part of it. Do you include uncertainty in some of your prediction?
So I would say not externally as an input, but what we do is that we are trying to test our model at different tolerances in the sense like how much solar is actually changing between 5 minutes or 15 minutes, and then how our model performs. So we are trying to introduce those kind of uncertainties, but
Wonderful.
not directly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Min Chen. I'm a global change ecologist from the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology here at UW-Madison. So it's kind of strange to present here, right? But yeah, but I will use the next 5 minutes to quickly go through interesting work that we have done a couple of years ago for estimating the solar energy that penetrates the Earth's atmosphere and finally arrives at the Earth's surface using a very interesting satellite called the Deep Space Climate Observatory, and the sensor on board that, which is called EPIC, which is Earth's Polychromatic Imaging Camera. So this Discovery satellite sits at a very unique orbit. It actually sits between the Sun and Earth, called L1 point, Lagrange 1, which is the fourth equilibrium point between Earth and the Sun. That means the satellite can sit between these two planets. Well, it's not planets, between these two atoms, and consistently observe the Earth's sunlit phase from dawn to the dusk. So it's kind of similar to the geostationary satellite. It observes a nice blue marble, but the difference is that the geostationary satellite always observes a certain part of the Earth, but the EPIC sensor observes the whole globe, but only in the daytime. So that perfectly gives us an opportunity to estimate the solar energy, because solar radiation only happens in the daytime. You can never see the sun in the night, right? So yeah, so you can clearly see the moon. There's a moon eclipse in 2017. That's how EPIC observes there. So the power of EPIC is it has like 10 spectral channels that observes some major atmospheric constituents that significantly interacts with the solar energy, and plus the clouds and aerosols, and those provides enough information for us to estimate the solar energy accurately. And we made that happen. We tested a variety of algorithms, including the process-based radiative transfer models, empirical models, and we finally identified the machine learning model. So it's always the king. And we can accurately estimate the hour-to-hour, day-to-day, season-to-season, and place-to-place variations of solar radiation at any places in the world. And our results benchmarked with site-level observations, the other independent data sources, and we all show that our results give us a high accuracy, as you can show here. You can see there. So yeah, again, to conclude my talk, I just want to give a few thoughts about the satellite for EAP. So the first thing that obviously satellite data, including the Discovery EPIC and many others, geostationary and some like MODIS, other satellite sensors, provides the most reliable data for solar energy resource measuring, monitoring, and verification. And the second, from the perspective of global change ecologist, so actually the motivation for doing that research is actually I want to better estimate the photosynthetic carbon uptake. So we need a better estimation of the solar radiation. So so using those data, we can accurate quantification of the global carbon cycle, and which is key to constrain our knowledge of climate change and influence the policy and regarding the grand challenges to the human. Yep, and finally, satellite observation not limited to solar radiation, and they can actually cover every aspect of what which are happening on the Earth, as you can hear here every hour, right? So I think it's very important to interact with people in different disciplines, like what we did here, and yeah, to promote the satellite for EAP. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to briefly take a step maybe farther down the data pipeline and look at how some of maybe these tools are being applied for energy analysis and policy right here in Wisconsin. This project was motivated by the Office of Sustainability to address the challenge that they have, which is trying to plan for a future where they have net zero energy from renewable energy developed on their own properties over across Wisconsin, and addressing the same issues that many organizations or states or municipalities are facing. That is, how do you site renewable energy in locations where there is a social and historical identity to different land uses? Land that we're using for renewable energy is not new. It has not been set aside for renewable energy generation. It is where it is coming in contact with existing uses and identities. So how can we enable the University of Wisconsin and the entire system to prepare themselves to have these cooperative developments with local communities? And the first step is developing and identifying the properties that have the most potential for succeeding from a technical and resource as well as organizational standpoint. So to do this, the first step we're taking is just to look at all of the resources that, in terms of land, that the system has, and rank those based on a few different criteria. This screening process was informed by the NREL technical potential tool, but it's augmented a few different ways. First of all, for the resource potential, we're using the NASA's power, as well as using some, we'll see here in a second, information for digital elevation data and so forth. But our hope is to first look at the potential, then look at the technical potential, and that has to do with existing generation sources, proximity to grid, proximity to existing power generation to get a sense of the congestion on those local transmission points. And finally, looking at the organizational potential, and that is looking at how many stakeholders currently have established claims to that space and their orientation to maybe developing renewable energy. So an example of how we're developing this data, this is one example for the slope analysis using digital elevation model in making the slope map for each property, and then making sure that we provide that slope information for the entire state. So just a very simple process that we're using for a lot of the different pieces. And the hope is that once you have a fully fleshed out slate of characteristics that a renewable energy developer might want, you can then identify those sites and work internally with the community that the land is with, and also internally at UW-Madison to try and establish the groundwork. Thank you. So that is the main piece, and a few takeaways here, and then I'll leave a little time for questions, is that, first of all, one of the biggest resources that limitations that are being run into currently is communities willing to allow these developments to go forward if they're conflicting with their current economic and social identity. And providing this information internal to a large organization, municipality or otherwise, can make that decision-making or the establishment of a project much easier, because you're building the groundwork far out ahead in time. And finally, there's to go look at the project, where we'll be updating with the data as it's developed, and hopefully it'll be a living project, and we'll update it with information going forward. So thank you.
We've got time for one question. I'll ask a question, Henry. Are you looking at?
It does. It does. I think a lot of the land that is in the UW system, a lot of it is north of the kind of wind generation development area that's happened in Wisconsin, which is obviously in the southern part of the state. So the focus has been looking at solar. There's also the question of different types of solar development that have different land use requirements if you're looking at agrivoltaics versus traditional utility scale. So wind potential will be included in all of those, but I suspect that often solar will be the one that is pursued long term. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the organizers for having me. I'm Andrew Hutchins. I'm a fourth-year econ PhD student over at North Carolina State University. And today, I'll try not to walk away from the mic. Let me not do that. Today, I'm going to talk about some joint work with some folks back at NC State, looking at the relationship between droughts and power plant efficiency. Okay, so let me make sure I get this right. There we go. Okay, so I shouldn't have to tell this crowd this or anything much about climate change, but climate change affects a myriad of environmental problems, many of which affect the energy sector, energy space. Droughts in particular are particularly relevant to the energy generation or provision space, insofar as thermoelectric power plants rely on water for cooling, right? So if you have less water, you're probably going to mess with the water that plants extract for their cooling up mechanisms. Okay, so basically droughts, in effect, act to increase plants' marginal cost of generation and decrease their efficiency. Okay, I put my engineer hat on for that latter part, so I'm happy to talk about it offline if you wish. I am an economist, but I did do some digging through engineering literature for that. Okay, but in effect, we get increase in plants' marginal cost of generation and a decrease in plant efficiency. Okay, so theoretically, plants that are located in market areas should be incentivized to respond to this increase in input costs by engaging in some cost minimizing behavior so they remain cost competitive. Right, our angle is that they will improve their efficiency in response to the increase in this input cost, right, so that they remain cost competitive in their competitive wholesale power market. Plants that are located in non-market areas are just cogs in the monopoly machine, if you will, because they are in areas that are governed by the classic vertically integrated monopolistic utility, right, like Duke Energy back in North Carolina or Florida Power and Light in my home state of Florida. Okay, and so the idea of this paper, let me move on here, is basically to figure out whether these theoretical market responses and non-market responses happen or play out in the U.S. power sector. Okay, so we hypothesize that plants in market areas will respond to drought by improving their efficiency, and plants in non-market areas will respond to drought by, well, not really responding to drought at all and just taking the efficiency losses, right? Because they operate in cost of service areas. Okay. Oh, quick note on the second question. I'm focusing on the first question and our reduced form approaches to answering it. The second question relies on machine learning models, which I do have and I'm willing to talk about, but in the interest of time and the cooler stuff, in my opinion, anyway, I'm going to focus on the first question. But I'm happy to talk about the machine learning stuff after the talk if you're curious. Okay, and so our empirical approach basically regresses generator level heat rate, which is our Y, onto drought bins, which are constructed from continuous drought measures, and also heat rate is also a function of that matrix X, which contains our control variables, net load, which is load net of renewable generation, as well as capacity factor, and what we call time and entity fixed effects. In the interest of time, I will have a delayed discussing that until after the talk if you're curious. But we control for basically everything we can't control. To isolate the impacts of droughts on power plant efficiency, generator level efficiency. Really, it's prime mover fuel type efficiency, but you can think of it as generator level efficiency. Okay, and so our PDSI measure is our drought measure is the PDSI, which is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. Some of you may be familiar with that index, and we get our data from the climatology lab's GridMet data. I believe that data is currently housed at UC Merced. I could be wrong. I might be wrong, but it's the GridMet data, and this GridMet data combines PRISM data with NASA's Land Data Assimilation System data to create weather variables as well as the PDSI itself at a 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer grid cell resolution, right? And so for the main results I'm going to show you today, I took the 10 nearest neighbors to each plant to construct an inverse distance weighted average PDSI at the plant level. Okay, so here are the results. It's a bit of a busy graph, and it's disappointing if you look at it closely, because I thought that was a question. We don't really get much evidence supporting either one of our hypotheses. If our hypothesis regarding market plants were supported, all of the colored dots and their corresponding confidence intervals would be well below the zero line, indicating a heat rate decrease and efficiency improvement, and all of the black dots and their corresponding confidence intervals would be well above the zero line, indicating an efficiency loss due to drought. Okay, so this is something that we're working on, but for now, given the granularity of the data, this just appears to be how plants are responding as far as the efficiency dimension goes. So thank you for your time.
Hi, my name is Maitrey. I am a PhD student in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering here, advised by Professor Leena and Professor Giri Venkatramanan. I will be talking about optimal home energy management for prepaid electricity customers. Now, there isn't a lot of satellite data linked to this, but I guess as we heard about it in the previous panel, the electric utility data and the meter data is something that can be thought of as equivalent to satellite data, and then that can be actually combined with satellite image data and geographical data to generate better results. So what is prepaid electricity? It's pay as you go. So you purchase credit before you use it. This is different from postpaid, where you use it over the month and you get a bill at the end. There are estimated to be about 3 million prepaid accounts in the United States. And some of the advantages include that customers don't have to pay a deposit, don't have to go through credit checks. They can pay as and when cash is available. And that's particularly useful for low-income households, and that means no bad debt for the utility. However, when the prepaid wallet hits zero, customers are automatically disconnected, and that can be particularly hazardous during extreme weather events and for medically fragile communities. These programs are particularly targeted towards low-income households, and these households are often households that experience high energy burdens. So they go into this heat or eat problem. So 37% of households surveyed who have high energy burdens went without medical care and sometimes even without food to pay for high utility bills. Now, prepaid electricity is something that does not address this core problem of unaffordability, but it does make users think about energy rationing. And what we want to do is design a framework for effective energy rationing so that their critical needs are not compromised upon. So the framework that we are using is based on a self-organizing framework, or SOLEAN for short, that I've worked on, but for batteries, so loads or appliances that are connected to batteries. We can think of the prepaid wallet like a battery. And in a simple example, when we have just 3 loads, a TV, lights, and a fridge, we assign a dollar amount or a threshold to each load. And as and when the user uses electricity, the wallet discharges, and one by one, the loads are curtailed, or the user is nudged to switch them off so that their critical loads are still catered to. This is a simple framework based on enabling instead of actuation, low hardware overheads, and in the interest of time, I'm not going into the depths of that, but I can talk about it further later. A very simple case study where on the y-axis, we are comparing how often are loads available when necessary. And on the x-axis is the percentage of amount the customer can pay for as compared to what they want to ideally use. So in each of these cases, we can see that the manager outperforms the baseline, and the way it does it is by making higher priority loads available for longer by compromising on lower priority loads. So a personal example would be, for me, a Wi-Fi router is much more critical than air conditioning. So I'd rather be sweaty for a few hours than not have internet for the whole day. So this manager takes into account these user-defined priorities and helps in effective energy rationing. So these were really preliminary results. This is ongoing work, and some of the things that we want to do are study the effects of imperfect forecasts, compare optimized versus fixed thresholds, and then propose design insights at the broader level for utilities for prepaid programs. And some of the contributions are that we recognize the need for energy rationing. We design a simple management framework with minimal hardware overheads, and we incorporate user-defined priorities to reduce these disconnections. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm Margaret Mooney. I work on campus for NOAA's Cooperative Institute for Meteorological Satellite Studies and Weather and Climate Education. And this includes an online course every summer in climate and climate change. We've been teaching it since 2013. We wrote a grant to develop the content, so we had a pre and post course survey on knowledge. And we used the survey results, to show in 2020 clear knowledge gains. So that was great. But what I really wanted to know was, did that make a difference in actions? Did anyone modify their behaviors with the new knowledge? So I started another survey and distributed it, and that's mostly what I'll be presenting on today. When it comes to carbon footprint, this is what the students indicated. 75% shifted away from red meat, 83% eliminating food waste, 83% driving less, 61% flying less, 94% reducing household energy and water, and 85% purchasing sustainable source food and products whenever possible. The other thing that I thought was super encouraging and exciting is that 92% of the students that took the course said that their new knowledge made it easier to talk about climate change and environmental issues with families and friends. For civic engagement, 68% of the students indicated they had become more civically engaged after taking the course. And we had a drop-down box, and so you can read some of the examples that the students provided. Also super exciting, 94% of them said they were either very likely or 100% likely to vote. So I thought that was great. I presented this at a conference, and someone raised their hand and said, "Where's your control group?" Well, of course, I didn't have one. But fortunately, Professor John Martin on campus worked with me, and we distributed a similar survey to his 100 level course. We've collected the data. We wrote up an article. We have a new publication in the Bulletin of American Meteorological Society. My co-authors are Kathy Middlecamp, John Martin, Steve Ackerman, and you can read the whole article. It's short, but super interesting. But the takeaways are, for the students that took climate and climate change, they indicated that they have taken actions, when you combine everything, to reduce carbon footprint either somewhat or a great deal 81% of the time. For the 100 weather and climate course, 74% of the time. I think this is so encouraging. The vast majority of students on the UW-Madison campus are doing things to address the climate crisis. And it's, these are science interested students, but super, I think, exciting. And the other thing I found rewarding to me is that the students who took the climate and climate change course indicated being 5 times more likely to discuss climate change as often as possible. But you don't have to listen to me, you can listen to them. The last week of class, they have to upload a elevator speech. They pretend they're on an elevator and someone says, "What do you think about climate change?" And the subset of students have allowed me to put them online. These are all less than 2 minutes. They're super interesting. And I'm just going to read one quote from one of them. "We were brought up and educated in a time when it was being discovered that climate change was a huge issue. I think there is some hope for us because as we move into positions of power, we have a brand new viewpoint about how the environment works and how much we should care about it and what we need to do." So I didn't ask these students about what they think about satellite data for energy analysis and policy, but I think we have their support. Thank you.
That's great. And we've got time for one question. Or maybe I'll just make a comment to the students in the audience. This is a very, very exciting time for earth scientists, atmospheric scientists, and it's great to see that here's quantitative data saying that this generation is embracing this as a major issue. So next up is Jason Otkin, and he's going to talk about droughts, energy, and satellite observations.
All right. Hi, everybody. Okay, so my name is Jason Otkin. I work at the Space Science and Engineering Center here at the University of Wisconsin. As Brad said, I'm going to be talking about droughts, energy, and satellite observations. So a drought is a naturally recurrent feature of the climate system that refers to a water deficit occurring over some period of time. Because these water deficits can impact the environment in different ways, several types of drought are recognized by the drought community. Traditionally, these have included meteorological, agricultural, hydrological, and socioeconomic drought. But in recent years, several new types of drought have also been recognized. These include droughts like ecological drought, which refers to the impacts of water stress on on the natural ecosystems, and then flash drought, which are droughts that develop very quickly over a few weeks. So in this talk, then, I'm going to briefly discuss how different types of drought can impact energy production and energy consumption, as well as how satellite observations can be used to monitor and predict their evolution. Okay, so first up is a meteorological drought. These are droughts that are characterized by precipitation deficits. It can be over different time periods. What I'm showing in the image are the precipitation deficits over a 12-month period ending on October 1st of 2021. An important thing to note here are that meteorological droughts are often accompanied by warmer than normal temperatures. This can then lead to higher energy demand during the summer because there'll be greater demand for air conditioning, but can lead to lower energy demand during the winter because there's going to be less demand for heating. So weather and climate models are used to forecast meteorological drought, and satellite observations are vital for these models because they provide important information about the atmosphere and also the land and ocean surfaces that are used to start those model forecasts. So hydrological drought is most important across the West United States because they are heavily dependent upon reservoirs and aquifers to meet their water needs. So most people here are going to be familiar with the so-called bathtub rings that surround many of the reservoirs in the West United States because they are very visible reminders of the extreme drought conditions that are impacting that part of the country. So reservoirs, of course, are often used to generate hydropower. So the falling water levels within them are leading to lower energy production because there's going to be less force to turn the turbine blades. For example, energy production at Lake Mead is currently about 33% below its peak capacity because of the low water levels. So for satellite observations, the GRACE satellite sensor can be used to monitor groundwater levels. So the image on the right, where you see that the red and the brown colors are indicating below normal groundwater levels. And these are in locations that are experiencing very severe drought conditions at this time. Agricultural drought is another important drought type that can impact energy consumption and energy use. So when drought conditions occur during the growing season, they can reduce corn yields, which in turn will impact the amount of ethanol that is produced within this country. In addition, droughts will reduce the amount of organic matter that are available for biomass energy production because plants tend to be smaller when they are stressed by stressed by drought. So there are many different data sets that have been developed from satellite observations to monitor drought conditions and vegetation. The image I'm showing on the right is from one that's known as Evapotranspiration Stress Index. It shows anomalies in the amount of transpiration or water vapor that's released by plants. This image is from the drought event that impacted this part of the country back in 2012. And on the red and brown colors are showing that the vegetation is very stressed across the Midwestern Corn Belt. And this is consistent with the picture that is shown on the left. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is flash drought. These are droughts that develop very quickly over a few weeks. They tend to occur most often during the growing season. And because of this, they can very strongly impact the health of vegetation. That's what I'm showing on the left, where the top two panels are showing how the native grassland vegetation across northern Oklahoma rapidly browned over a 5-week period during the 2012 flash drought. And that stands in on sharp contrast to the continued greenness of the vegetation over the same time period in 2014, as shown in the bottom two panels. So among the various impacts, flash droughts can reduce crop yields, but they can also lead to larger and more intense fires. And then the smoke from these fires can limit the amount of solar energy that can be produced by reducing the amount of sunlight at the surface. And I'll end by just noting that many satellite drive data sets are available to monitor vegetation health. So if you're interested in learning more about these tools or drought in general, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia Taylor, and I'm with the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering here at UW. My advisor is Lena Rold. You may have heard her speak earlier today in one of the panel sessions. And today I'll be talking about my research that's looking at the risk of electric power lines igniting wildfires and how we can define that risk and then mitigate that risk by undergrounding electric power lines. So the problem here is, as I mentioned, power lines are able to ignite wildfires, and this happens when an electric fault occurs. And so an example of this is in the image here, where you have a tree branch that's fallen across two electrical conductors, and you have some arcing that's happening there and sparking. And there's a release of a high energy, high temperature fault current, and that sparking can lead to a wildfire ignition if the conditions in the area around the power line are hot and dry and windy. So it's important for utilities to mitigate this risk, and there are some risk mitigation strategies that are currently implemented. For example, utilities currently will shut off power lines in areas of high wildfire risk, and this is really effective at reducing the risk of ignition. But unfortunately, it leads to unreliable access to electricity when you have power outages. Another risk mitigation strategy is putting overhead power lines underground, and this is effective at mitigating the risk of ignition, and it also reduces the need to shut off power lines. However, it's really expensive to underground power lines. So it's really important to prioritize which power lines you're putting underground so that you can minimize this cost. And so that's the question that we're trying to answer here. And we're attempting to make that decision through a mathematical optimization model that we've developed, which selects which power lines to put underground to minimize the system-wide wildfire risk for a specified investment budget. And here it's really important to carefully consider how you're defining wildfire risk, because this goes into quantifying the parameters in our mathematical optimization model. And so here we define the risk as a function of the probability of an electric fault, as well as the wildfire potential in the area surrounding the line. And so for the probability of electric fault, we're quantifying that using known statistics, because it's really hard to get access to more specific grid data, because a lot of that is proprietary. But for example, lower voltage distribution lines are 3 times as likely to ignite a wildfire as higher voltage transmission lines. And so we can use those types of trends to scale our risk value. Then for wildfire potential, we're using satellite-based wildfire risk maps. Okay, and so this is the risk map that we're using here, which is the Wildland Fire Potential Index map from the US Geological Survey. And so we use that map and assign risk values to our lines. But as you can imagine, there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. And so some of our results here, we've produced a data set of risk values as assigned to lines in power systems, so other researchers can use this. We've also looked at multiple days of wildfire risk to capture temporal variation in wildfire risk. Here I'm just showing how your choice of how you define a risk of a particular line segment will actually result in different lines that are selected for upgrade. So it's important to carefully consider how you're defining that risk. Here I'm showing the importance of looking at small line segments when you're defining the risk of a particular line segment. And the result here is that you can achieve a greater risk reduction for the same investment budget by looking at smaller line segments. And finally, we in this last test case, we are showing that the method is scalable to large systems because we selected lines for all of the transmission lines in California. And in this test case, we also are trying to demonstrate the probability, how you can incorporate the probability of an electric fault into this upgrade selection. So in conclusion, utilities are forced to consider about how their power lines are igniting wildfires. And we proposed a simple way that you can try to mitigate this risk through optimal line upgrades. In our current work, we are exploring different strategies to mitigate wildfire risk, as well as reduce the need for power shutoffs, such as through placement of distributed energy resources and microgrids. And another thing that we're trying to do is represent vulnerability and equity in our modeling so that we're making decisions that work for all customers. So thank you.
Hi, everyone.
everyone. My name is Louis. I'm the first year PhD student at Nelson Institute. Today I'm going to share my word about measuring renewable energy uncertainty, policy uncertainty.
Just don't be so close.
The United States have introduced various types of energy policies to incentivize the use of renewable energy since 1990. So the over past 2 decades have witnessed a rapidly increasing rapid growth of of private sector and the public sector investment in the energy industry. But it's worth noting that if the energy companies are mostly characterized by their large scale and long payback period. So they are much more sensitive to policy, much more sensitive to government inventions. So people are concerned that if the policy,
okay, you don't have to be right next to it.
Okay. So people are concerned that if if most of the driving force for investing company mostly comes from the policy incentives, then the uncertainty from the policy uncertainties will affect the investment decisions. Therefore, we create a new index to measure the renewable energy policies, and then applying this index to investigate how the renewable energy policy will affect the investment decisions. The renewable energy policy in US can be divided into 2 categories. There are financial incentives and regulatory policies. And the uncertainty driving factors from these policies are about whether the existing policies will be extended or not, who will make the new policies, what the new policies will be, when will the new policies be adopted, and what consequences these policies will bring about. And we found the newspaper can serve as a valuable information source to capture the uncertainty. It's because the writers or special commenters will discuss their perspectives in the newspaper articles, which will indicate the social sentiment towards the future. And also a previous study from a team led by Scott Baker in Chicago have already proved the possibility of a newspaper approach. And they had verified that the newspaper approach can provide a good proxy for policy uncertainty after comparing with other text sources, and also by human auditing verification. And they found that the investors' sentiments in financial market if they focus on the financial market. And also, furthermore, we found that the relationship between the new energy policies in force and the related publication in US leading newspaper. And as the figure showed above, when the number of new energy policies in force declines, the number of the related newspaper articles inclines. Therefore, we found that this newspaper approach can serve as is reasonable if we set up the searching keywords to the search conditions that select the targeted articles that contain the needed information we need. And then we select the 10 leading US national newspaper and the 20 selected state newspaper to create our index. After some rank count on the volume of the newspaper articles, as well as some normalization and centralization process, we then create our monthly renewable energy policies uncertainty index from 1998 to 2021. Our measure criteria here is that the higher index value is, the higher the renewable energy policy uncertainty is. And we provide different ways to verify this index. And one straightforward way is to use a time series comparison to see whether it can provide plausible quantifications to historical events associated with a new act in action, or some events that have the strong energy market connection. And as the figure show above, this index will react strongly around the new act in action, and it also reacts strongly in the financial crisis of 2008. And in the near 2020s, it shows response stronger to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in our future empirical research, we found this index is very helpful for studying both micro and macroeconomics question. And we provide further evidence here on the implication of this index to study the dynamic effect of renewable energy policy uncertainty on firm level and industrial level investment. One of our main findings is that a shock in renewable energy policy uncertainty can induce a persistent decline of investment in the overall clean energy industry. If you feel interested about my work and want to get more details about it, you can reach out to me by my email. Thank you.
Thanks. Looks like I'm the real last one, so I'll try to make it quick and get you all released. So, hi everyone. My name is Li Yanfeng. I'm a PhD student at Department of Environmental Health and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University, and I study methane emissions from energy industry. And here, my topic already released some information about my talk on the US methane trend, but really, the rationale behind the study is about, so we know since 2005, with the technology breakthrough of hydraulic fracturing, there are tons, huge amount of methane has been released into the air from the oil and gas sector, and it raised huge debate on what's going on with the US atmospheric methane trend. And previous studies looked into this problem, but different groups are getting conflicting estimate trends as listed in here. So my question is yeah, but what's going on, right? Why you guys are getting conflicting trend estimates? And so to answer that question, we have a hypothesis that the meteorology produces an upward trend in the atmospheric methane, and the interannual variability in meteorology can help resolve the disagreement. Then we use these atmospheric transport models with emission fluxes data to test on our hypothesis. And basically we designed a controlled experiment to see whether by fixing the IAV in the meteorology or the trend in emissions, are they to evaluate their impact on the estimated trends. And here are the results. And I don't think I have time to go through the figure, but basically we find that meteorology yields an upward trend in the atmospheric methane across the US. So we now know meteorology is playing the role, but what's in the meteorology is driving the trend. We further evaluated 3 meteorology factors. We have the PBL height, the vertical wind speed, and the total wind speed. And we find the IAV in annual average, the local wind speed, presents strongest anti-correlation with methane enhancement. That means, here are the takeaway messages. That means meteorology yields an increasing trend in atmospheric methane observations, and IAV in local wind speed can explain IAV in methane at many atmospheric observation sites. And really the indication of the study is the study cautions against interpreting trends in the atmospheric GHG mixing ratios as a direct proxy for trend estimation for emissions. And this study lends support for existing studies that shows little or no trend in the methane emissions. And thank you.
We do have time for questions.
Okay.
So you can stay up here.
Sure.
And I found your talk. It was both. There were 2 labeled 6. That's my mistake. Any questions? I have a quick question. So you use WRF still.
Yeah.
So that allows trajectory sort of things. Were you actually linking the satellite observations back to the emissions?
Yes, good question. So I guess the use of satellite data chimed in here. So we're generating work still footprints for both in situ observation locations and the go site observation locations.
Okay, great.
So we're basically just simulating go site observations like using those locations.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Right.
Oh,
I've got a question if there's time.
Hi.
go right ahead.
Great. So if I'm understanding this correctly, essentially changes in meteorology, i.e. climate change, caused explains an increase in atmospheric methane emissions, even irrespective of methane emission levels. Like if they stayed the same, we'd still see this increase. So what do you think are the implications of this? How generalizable do you think this is? Does this mean that we're going to see a feedback loop where methane, even if methane emissions stay steady or start to fall, we might see increases in atmospheric concentrations?
Well, I don't want to comment on the long term for now, but the direct implication is when you're trying to estimate trend from, say, like GHG emissions, you got to consider everything, including the meteorology, instead of just looking at the observations from whatever like instrument you're using.
Thank you.